Becoming Steve Jobs, the evolution of a reckless upstart into a visionary leader. It's a new biography, and what makes this one stand out is the fact that it has Apple's seal of approval. Written by Brent Schlender and Rick Tetzeli, who spent 25 years in the company of Jobs as journalist, writing all about the Silicon Valley. And delighted to say we're joined now by Rick. Sadly, Brent is unable to join us, but Rick, thanks very much for being in New York for us. I said what makes it stand out is that it has Apple's seal of approval. And when you consider there are other biographies and a film, how important was it to you that Apple has backed this book?
Well, we didn't get Apple's seal of approval for about 2 years. We started reporting the book in the summer of 2012. And originally, Apple slammed the door shut in our faces. They did not want to cooperate with another book. They had cooperated with the Walter Isaacson biography, and I think they thought that was enough. So we reported around them for a long time, and we finally got some interviews with current Apple employees in April of 2014, at which point we'd really written a lot of the book. We had to rework some stuff as a result of that, and it appears that it seems that people at Apple like this book, but that's perhaps more a reflection of the fact that what we were trying to do with Becoming Steve Jobs is show his evolution as a person and as a business leader. My co-writer Brent Schlender knew Steve and covered him for 25 years, and he believed that Steve had changed more than any other businessman he had covered. And we both felt that that hadn't been reflected in previous books or movies or anything.
Let's look at that character, because towards the end, or in the last few years, and you write in the book, Jobs says about himself, "I am who I am." But that person seemed to have been so many different people. I mean, it's described in so many ways in this book. A unique soul, someone who had the courage to say he was wrong, to someone who was rash. How would you describe him?
Well, I think that the thing is that he was complex, and he changed over the course of his life. And both Brent and I felt that the view of him that had been accepted was a static view based on behaviors he had shown as a young man. After 1987, a couple of years after he'd been exiled from Apple for the first time, he basically cut off press access except when he had a product to introduce. And he really made a big effort to ensure that the press did not write about his personal life, did not have access to his personal life. So the change that happened was not something that people were able to really document while he was alive. Furthermore, as you said, Steve said, "I am what I am." He was not a retrospective guy. He hated to look back. He hated to think about what the sources of his behavior were. At one point during an interview with Brent started asking him about persistence. Why was he such a persistent guy? And Steve said to him, "Who are you, Larry King?" He just, that was not something he wanted to discuss.
Yeah, I mean, he did say, "What's the point in looking back?" I think that's the quote, right? "I'd rather look forward to all the good things to come." And that, I suppose, it is quite poignant for a man who was, some say, quite narrow-minded in this constantly looking forward and the next product.
He was looking forward at everything. I think that, Steve was not a religious man in the last 15, 20 years of his life, but Buddhism was important to him. It had helped shape him as a young man. And there's the whole idea of becoming in Buddhism. You're always in the process. You're always becoming something new. And that is the way he thought about things. He thought, what's next? What am I going to do next? What's Apple's next product? You know, how are we going to take what we've learned and improve going forward? Johnny Ive told us that there are two critical products after, when you make a product, you're left with two critical things at the end. You're left with the product itself, and you're left with everything that you learned about, everything that you learned during the process of making the product. And the learning, I've said, is at least, if not more important than the product itself. That's why the two of them, I think, you know, jibed so well. They came to things from such different perspectives and from such different backgrounds, but they thought in very much the same way.
Actually, relationships form a key part of this book, doesn't it? The relationship with Johnny Ive and also with Tim Cook. And that's one that I picked up on quite a lot. And I suppose a lot of people now will be, because he is now the CEO of Apple. From the incident about the liver when Cook offered his own to Jobs, to the final film they watched together, and the fact that Cook still has Jobs' phone number in his phone. All these things really give you, I suppose, a clear insight into the man Jobs was. Was there anything along this way that you discovered that really stood out to you, that surprised you, I suppose?
Well, I was very surprised by the intensity of those close relationships. One of the interesting things going into the book was that, you know, my co-writer, Brent, had this long relationship with Steve. But in some ways, he didn't know where he stood with Steve. What did Steve actually think about him? What was their relationship really all about? Because it had been a kind of friendship, and it had also been a journalist-source relationship. And what we came to see in the course of the reporting was that Steve had Apple, his family, and this close circle of friends. If you were outside of that, you didn't get the same warmth, you didn't get the same humanity that you did if you were inside that circle. So Brent saw glimpses of that, and Brent, you know, he and Steve actually did have small talk from time to time, but he came to understand that, you know, he had a warm relationship with Steve. Steve cared about Brent, but also when Steve decided that Brent could no longer write about Fortune could no longer write about Apple in Fortune the way that Steve wanted him to, he dumped him.
Yeah, I mean, and Brent mentions that caused problems at the end because he didn't get to say goodbye to a certain extent, doesn't he?
Yeah, and it's a very human thing, you know. Brent regrets to this day that he did not go over to Steve's house when Steve invited him over for one of these sort of last walks that he was having with people who meant a lot to him in his life. But you know, that's what it's very human.
Yeah, but that relationship in itself has actually been one of the criticisms of the book, in that because Brent had this relationship with Jobs and was one of a few that got close to him. You talked about the warmth and humanity, that people say, actually, is the book slightly biased the other way, compared to some of the other books we've seen?
Well, I understand the criticism. I think that it's a criticism that Brent has encountered before. I think we used that relationship as a way of looking at Steve in a way that we felt had not been done before. I think that the book is, people who have read through the whole book can see that, you know, we take on these issues of Steve's Steve's being difficult, of his backdating stock option scandals, of issues with Foxconn and things like that in the book. As to, I personally think there are going to be many more books about Steve Jobs, and I think that this is an intimate perspective on the man that shows how he changed as a human over the course of time. So of necessity, we get closer to him than some past books.
When you say closer to him, what do you think people then should take away? I mean, you talk about so many different instances in the book, from the early days when he first met McKenna, was a smelly because he deemed deodorant, shoes and the like affectations. I mean, that's not an image we associate with the Steve Jobs many of us think we know.
Well, I think that's the thing, is that, what fascinates me is that, everybody is obsessed with whether Steve Jobs was a good guy or a bad guy.
Does that not matter? Do you think it's about him as a leader then?
I don't think it matters. I think he was human. I think he did some really terrible things in his life. I think denying the paternity of his first daughter is the primary example of that. I think he was unnecessarily rude to many people, but he also did some incredibly, kind and generous things. In that way, he's a lot like a lot of people I know, certainly, who have done terrible things and good things. I'm one of those people.
Well, I won't go into that, but that kind of takes us back.
What's more interesting is his evolution as a businessman. If people are looking for lessons from the life of Steve Jobs, I think you want to consider the whole thing. And why did he change? And what did he learn? And what did he see? I think sometimes with businessmen or business people who are as outstanding as Jobs, we look for simple lessons. We want shortcuts to success. And I don't believe in those shortcuts. I don't think they exist. I think it's more that you have to try to look at yourself and what you're doing and how can you improve, and you can pick up bits and pieces from different people and apply them to your own life and to your own success as a business person. It's a more complex thing than just saying Steve kept things simple or Steve valued design. It was a combination of things that made Apple a great success.
I'm going to talk about Apple in just a second. I'm picking up on the word you're using there, is this businessman, because in Steve's own words, he had said he didn't want to be a businessman because of the businessman he knew, he didn't like what he saw, basically. So for him then to become this great leader, this great businessman, really, I suppose, amplifies the changes in him that happened over the years?
I think that's true. One of the interesting things about the life of Steve Jobs is the way that certain things that happened in his life reflect the broad societal changes that happened over that life. For instance, he started out as a classic 1960s anti-establishment guy, but he became the leader of the most valuable company on earth. So that's as capitalistic as you can possibly get. So I think that over those years, something has happened in the culture where business, and we write a lot about this at Fast Company, where I'm an editor, business is not seen as, an establishment, boring, conventional kind of life. You can be creative in your business. And so that's what happened to him. He found a creative way of doing great business. The other enormous change in corporate life that occurred over the course of his years is in design. You know, when Steve started out at Apple, even when he returned to Apple in 1997, design was an afterthought. You never had a chief design officer at a big company who was at the same level as the CIO or the CTO or COO or anything like that. Now, design is central to the life of corporations big and small.
And particularly Apple. And I want to bring this in because in the book it talks about the fact that Apple was a company with a unique soul when Jobs was in charge. Do you think that is still the case?
I do. I think that you know, when he died, it seemed impossible that Apple could carry on in an equally creative way after his death. I think that if you look at the products Apple has introduced in that period, and if you look at the philosophy behind the Apple Watch, it's clear to me that they are still doing great, ambitious things. I can't predict in any way that Apple will continue to be the most valuable company on the earth. I can't predict whether the watch will be a success or not. But the decision-making process is still remarkably creative and nimble for a company that is twice as big as when he died.
We are running out of time, Rick, so finally I would just like to say, I know there's bits that will stick with me. For you, is that there one paragraph, there's one sentence from Jobs that really you think sums up what becoming Steve Jobs is all about?
I think that what really sums it up for me is the word becoming. I was at a dinner party with a friend of mine early on in this process, and we didn't know what the title of the book was going to be, and she said, "Becoming Steve Jobs." And to me, that's really what it's about. It's about recognizing that his life, like many of ours, is about the process of becoming something, of trying to improve. And he did that in a spectacular way that has affected millions and millions of people.
Okay, well, Rick, I have to say the thing that I take away is one of his quotes, which is the return on luck. What you do with it when you get it, what matters is how you play the hand you're dealt. And I think a lot of people can sort of...
Absolutely.
Exactly. Well, thanks very much, Rick Tetzeli, co-author of Becoming Steve Jobs. Thanks very much for your time. And we wish, of course, Brent good health too.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.